You. So welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you decided to join PAN today for a conversation with Starhawk on permaculture, activism, and spirituality. My name is Patty Love and I'm the PAN board treasurer. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Chelsea Green Publishing, an employee-owned company that takes a broad worldwide perspective, publishing authors from many countries, including the US, and disseminating their ideas to build bridges, build and expand communities to regenerate the earth and restore the human spirit. Their support helps us pay for the extra staff time and the infrastructure that makes this webinar possible, while also keeping it free for our members. So a hearty thank you goes out to Chelsea Green, and we encourage you to learn more about them at chelseagreen.com. Just some quick information about PAN is that we are a 501c3 organization. Our mission is to increase the resilience of the Northeast region while strengthening the regional permaculture network and increasing access to relevant education and resources. In 2018, the PAN board decided to start this webinar series in response to questions that we were getting from our membership and across the network, asking folks where folks were asking us what they could do after they got their PDC or what else they needed to know to build and keep their permaculture skills sharp. So the webinar series was born. We have been able to keep it free for our members, and we offer it on a sliding scale to non-members. A one-year membership in PAN is either $30, $50, or $100, depending on your self-selected level as a student or low-income person, a standard membership, or a business. So if you're a regular attendee of our webinars, you might find that you save some money by becoming a member, and then you also have the additional benefits of being eligible for our fiscal sponsorship and other discounts that we offer for events. And one of those events is that we've assembled a team that's working on planning a 2020 Northeast Permaculture Convergence at the Hostel at D Acres in New Hampshire, July 24th through 26th. So we'll have more to tell you about that as we design those details. I want to remind you that at the end of the conversation that Starhawk is bringing to us, we'll have about 15 minutes or so for question and answers. You can type your questions into the chat window at any time, and we will get to those as we are able to do. And I will be staying on the webinar afterwards for about 15 minutes or so to answer any networking questions or give us the chance to meet and get to know each other a little bit more. I want to transition into appreciating that Starhawk is here today donating her time. Starhawk is a person who has been really influential in my life, and both in terms of the work that she's done in writing books on spirituality and ecofeminism, along with permaculture books and the Earth Activist training, which has really been a significant experience in my life. So I'm really appreciative that she's joining us today. If you don't already know, she's the author or co-author of 13 books, including The Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, and the ecotopian novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, and its sequel, The City of Refuge. Her most recent nonfiction book is The Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups, which discusses group dynamics, power, conflict, and communications. Starhawk also founded the Earth Activist training, teaching permaculture design grounded in spirituality with a focus on activism. And Starhawk travels internationally, lecturing and teaching on earth-based spirituality, the tools of ritual, and the skills of activism. So in addition to listening to her today, we hope that you will visit her website after the webinar at starhawk.org to learn more about her events and projects and ways that you can join in. So with having said that, Starhawk, I'd like to turn the conversation over to you.
Hi, Penny. Good morning. It's lovely to be with you this morning. And hello, everybody. Um, when I agreed to do this, I was thinking a lot about what those intersections are between permaculture, spirituality, and activism. Um, I've been teaching permaculture for about 20 years now. And I came to it after many decades of teaching and working with earth-based spirituality. And I came to that out of activism, out of our feminist awakening in the late 60s and early 70s, when we started to look at the way power in our society is distributed according to gender. And many of us were asking the question, has it ever been different? Have there ever been societies where men weren't the ones that ruled and were in charge, and where women had rights and had power and had agency? Um, and we discovered, first of all, of course, that there are many indigenous cultures still around that have very different roles for women, for many other genders, for men, um, that were much more complex than the simplistic kind of divisions that we saw. And those were also cultures that had a different kind of view of spirituality, where spirit was not something removed from the world and outside the world, but where everything in the world was imbued with spirit and with sacredness. Then we also discovered that this was true even in Europe and in the Middle East, the home of our great religions. If you go back far enough, you'll find that there were earlier cultures that were what we like to call matrifocal, meaning focused on the mother principle, not necessarily matriarchal in the sense of ruled by or power over. There was the work of Maria Gimbutas, the archaeologist who did some of the major work on the ancient goddess cultures, was very influential. And a lot of us were not just satisfied with the history, we wanted to do it and to practice it. And we began creating rituals for ourselves. We began learning from people who had pieces of some of the traditions that had survived as herbalism, as fairy tales, as folklore, as folk tales, as the lore of the witches, who were the remnants of the wise women and the healers and the shamans. We began to see that the persecution of the witches in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was really a persecution of this older way of knowing, and had left scars, or psychic scars, on all of us. That makes it a lot harder, I think, for us to reconnect to what is really our human heritage of that ability to deeply connect with nature. So after all of this, sometime in the late 80s, I was at a friend's house, and she had just come back from taking a permaculture design course, and she was all excited by it. And I got very excited by it and started reading and learning about it. It took me until I think it was 1997 before I could actually take a PDC with Penny Livingston Stark. And to me, the wonderful thing about permaculture was it was so aligned with my sense of spirituality. In fact, it seemed like the practical application of the idea that the earth is sacred. So I want to say a few things about both what I think permaculture brings into the world of spirituality and the world of activism, and also why I think it is important to have some ideas about spirituality in the world of permaculture. And where, to me, where they come together, and to me, the underlying principle of all the permaculture ethics and principles is the idea of interconnectedness, that we live in a world which is deeply, deeply interconnected. And that goes on every level, from the interconnectedness of the microorganisms in the soil with the roots, to the interconnectedness of ideas, to the interconnectedness of human beings. To me, that's a spiritual principle. It's an ethical principle that underlines the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, and what I like to frame the third one as future care. And it also requires us to shift our way of thinking, because when we come out of Western culture, we tend to see the world as a bunch of separate, isolated objects. And we see their interactions as simple chains of cause and effect. It's kind of the mechanistic model of the universe that came to us out of the Enlightenment, and that forms the basis for, the traditional scientific method. You isolate one thing and then you try to vary it and see what the difference is. But when we look at the world as interconnected, we have to shift our way of thinking and start looking at systems, not just as at separate elements. So I always tell people, like, I've always loved to garden. When I got into permaculture, it was partly because I love gardening. And when you love gardening, you tend to love garden catalogs, seed catalogs, and those beautiful rose catalogs where you can kind of take them to bed and lust after that beautiful, gorgeous David Austin rose with a million petals that looks so romantic and so fluffy. But when you start doing permaculture, you kind of shift. You're not sitting there thinking like, I have to have that rose because it looks so pretty. You're looking at it and saying, what does a rose do? What are its interactions? What are its associations? What are its qualities? Where can I place that rose in the landscape where I might get multiple benefits? Maybe instead of that fluffy, pink, romantic, multi-petaled rose, I might choose a simpler rose that's closer to a native rose that might actually allow pollinators to get at the flowers, and that might produce hips that I can use. Roses have thorns, and maybe instead of complaining about that, I might think about where that rose, maybe instead of putting barbed wire on my fence to keep those annoying little boys next door out of my garden, planting a rose might be a much more beautiful, elegant way of doing it. And if I plant it with the right companions and I choose the right variety, maybe I don't have to have one of those fussy roses you have to spray and nurture and fuss over. I could have a wilder rose that's going to create an effective barrier, that's going to feed pollinators, that's going to give me rose hips. So in permaculture, we're always looking at relationships, and that's what comes out of the idea of interconnectedness. And to me, that is a deeply spiritual, deeply sacred idea. In fact, we hear that from indigenous people. The Lakota always end by saying, "Ho mitakweyasa," meaning all my relations. I'm related. I'm a relative of the animals, of the plants, of the stones, of the stars. When we think of the world in terms of relationship, we're also, again, we're thinking in terms of systems. It's much more complex than just looking at separate isolated objects. And if we're designing something in permaculture, even if it's a garden or if it's a building, we're looking at it as a living system. Again, not just as a bunch of forms and geometry, but how is that building going to get its energy? How are those walls going to breathe? How is it going to interact with the environment around it? What kind of social interactions is the form of that building going to encourage? So I think that is one of the places where permaculture, spirit coincide. And I want to say a little bit about what I think that can bring into activism, because right now we're going into a year, right, leading up to the next election, where I think a lot of people are asking themselves, how am I going to stay sane and actually get some sleep, in this next year? What am I going to do to try to influence these immense larger systems that surround us, that many of us would probably prefer to not have much to do with, but we're really in a situation right now where the ecological problems of climate change are happening on such a scale that we can't afford to ignore those larger systems. We need to bring them into alliance, and we need to get them activated in the right direction instead of doing what they're doing right now, which is generally pushing us exactly in the wrong direction. And I think permaculture has some lessons to teach activists. And the first is this idea, again, of looking at things as interconnected. That includes looking at systems of oppression as interconnected. We don't need to be in a competition about what is the primary oppression, whether it's gender or race or class or, something else. We have to look at them and say, in permaculture terms, we talk about guilds, we talk about communities of plants and animals that mutually support each other. Well, we could talk about a sort of nasty ism guild out there of all of, of race and sex and class oppression that is all mutually reinforcing. You can't just deal with one. You have to deal with the whole thing and transform it. And that's hopeful, because if we can transform any one of those things, then we weaken the grip of all of the others. The other aspect of that interconnectedness, I think, is understanding that we need to do more than just say no. We do need to say no as activists a lot, to the destruction that's going on around us. But I believe that no is always stronger when behind it we know what the yes is, when we know the vision of what we want. And if we look at something like climate change, for example, not just as carbon numbers, but as massive ecosystem destruction, then we know that the counter to it is large-scale ecosystem regeneration. And that includes human ecosystems, systems of politics, of economics, the social systems that we live in. Those are also part of our ecosystems. So the good news is we know how to do that in permaculture. We have great examples of amazing projects that have been done everywhere from forests to grasslands to out and out deserts that have taken damaged land and brought it back to life and brought it back to health. And that to me is one of the really hopeful things that we have to offer and that we have to bring. We have the tools and the skills and the insights. And again, they all go back to that basic understanding of interconnectedness. So I think permaculture, in that sense, has a lot to offer activism because we bring that understanding, you know, that human beings don't have to just be a blight on the planet, that we have the capacity to intervene in the destruction and do that in a very positive way. I know we were going to stop at the end and take questions, but maybe I'll just pause right now, if that works for you, Patty, and let people respond a little bit, because otherwise I feel like I'm babbling on into the void.
Sure, we can do that. We actually have, I think, what is maybe a great conversation to launch another section of this discussion, which is the question that's asked is something that one of our attendees has been struggling with for a little bit, or rolling with, as he says. So the questions are, what role can reconciliation practices play in our activist lives, especially how we heal relational ruptures and dramas that unfold internal to our various social scenes? If we're contemplating reconciliation with the past, genocide and slavery, how can we practice that in our small scenes to prepare for more nation to nation scale forms of reconciliation?
Wow, a beautiful question. You know, I was a film student for a while at UCLA, and I had a screenwriting teacher. And when he didn't like somebody's script, he would always say, he writes like he's heard about people, but never actually met any. And sometimes I think that is true about our activist culture. We have an activist cultures that seem like we've heard rumors about people, but aren't actually very familiar with them and have expectations that people are going to behave in ways that people really just rarely do behave. A lot of our activist culture right now seems to involve constantly telling people they're wrong, or they're saying something wrong, or they're doing something wrong, and oftentimes working so hard to avoid hurting someone or avoid harm that we actually create a great deal of unsafety. So I think that where permaculture can impact that is, again, you know, in permaculture, we do that thing of the chicken. You know, you draw the chicken and you say whether it's needs and whether it's inputs, whether it's outputs, whether it's yields. I mean, we can do that about human beings too. What are our needs beyond our physical needs and our need for safety and security? I think we have three really primary needs that I see. We need to belong to something. We're social animals. We're not meant to be isolated individuals. We need to feel a sense that we belong to something larger than ourselves. We need to feel seen and valued for who we are, not just as a category, but for our unique gifts and the unique things we have to bring. And we need to feel like we have an impact on the world. Ideally, that's making a contribution to the thing that we belong to. And I think when movements are really successful is when they provide for those needs. When they give people a sense of being part of something that's bigger than just their individual comfort or profit. When they develop an internal culture that really sees and appreciates people for who they are, and that focuses on building real relationships, not just orchestrating rules about certain categories. And when they give people a chance to make a contribution, to make an impact. I've been in many, many mobilizations and convergences, for example, when we were doing a lot of actions around global justice back in the aughts. And well, the beautiful thing is people would come together and it was like you'd have to set up a whole community. You might be camping, you might be sleeping on floors, but you need food, you need water, you need sanitation, you need spaces to meet, you need a legal team, you need a media team, you need a logistics team. And somehow that would miraculously all come together. And people would come, you know, nobody was getting paid, nobody was making money, but people were so excited to be in a community, again, where they could feel like they were part of something. They could make a contribution, whether that was cooking food or helping to plan the, you know, route for the actions, or facilitating a meeting. They were, you know, they were able to contribute what they could contribute and felt valued for that. So when we get into the ideas of conflict, I think it helps to go back and say, which of those needs are not getting met here? In what ways are we making people feel unwelcome? Especially people who have been made to feel unwelcome because of race or class or gender in many, many other situations. But also in, you know, in contesting that, you know, we don't have to do it by making other people feel unwelcome. I think we do it by creating situations where people can actually build real relationships. And that means struggle sometimes. That means conflict. Because in any human relation, you're going to have times of conflict. Conflict arises because you have different needs or different desires, or different goals or different perceptions. And again, I think one of the contributions of permaculture is this understanding that difference doesn't have to be bad. Diversity in ecosystems is one of our principles. It's what brings resilience. So how do we learn to embrace those differences, embrace that diversity? There are many, many tools we have for conflict resolution, for good communication. I actually wrote a whole book called The Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups, that talks about a lot of these because I have been in so many groups and saw them struggling with so many of the same issues. So I really encourage activist groups and permaculture groups to get some training in that. And in our permaculture courses, we always do include some training in communication skills and in conflict resolution skills, because, you know, in designing a permaculture system, the vegetables are the easy part. You know? Someone said intentional communities rarely fail because of their gray water system. It's always about the human systems, the conflict systems. You know.
I understand that, and have experienced some of what you're speaking about in my own pursuit of this work. And even at some of the events that I've been at with you. So I really am taking to heart your questions. We do have another great question here, I think, and what I want to say is that I feel like it's been a great privilege for me to be able to both attend as a student and then also to help with the teaching of your Earth Activist training. So I think I know the answer to this question, and I'd like to hear you expand on it. So the question is, do you think there's a place for discussion of spirituality in a PDC? The person who's asking us this question writes that he feels that the permaculture systems view of things can be applied to patterns of belief, something like a mythological pattern literacy. He's unsure how to approach that pedagogically, where one can also make room for animism, atheism, mono and polytheism. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as you know, I always include spirituality in our permaculture design courses because I feel like that is the zone zero. That is where we need methods and tools for personal regeneration. So we always start every morning with some kind of circle. We do grounding, we sing together, we honor the elements of air and fire and water and earth and spirit. We have a chance for people to do that in many different creative ways. But I think the way I look at it is if we shift our view of spirituality, so we understand that spirituality isn't necessarily about a belief system. It's not about believing in something you can't see. It's really a system of shifting our perception and our experience of what we can see, so that, you know, we see a tree and right now it's autumn and the leaves are starting to fall and the leaves drop to the ground and they compost and they feed the roots of that tree. And I know that intellectually, from science, from studying it, I can see that with my own eyes. But the spirituality part is understanding that as a sacred cycle, approaching that with a feeling of awe and reverence, really taking the time to watch and look and contemplate it, meditate on it, really appreciate the incredible miracle and the incredible cycle that it is. To me, that's the kind of spirituality we can bring into any permaculture course without, you know, stepping on people's toes of the things that they do believe in, because we don't want, again, we want people to feel welcome, whether they're deeply religious or whether they're atheists or whether they're not quite sure. It's not our job to tell people, again, what to believe in. I think it is our job to help people open up to that soul renewing experience of interacting with the world as it is and doing that with that depth of reverence and wonder that brings spirituality in. And when we do that, that's also, I think, what replenishes us, what feeds our soul, what feeds our spirit, what helps us to keep going even when there's setbacks, even when times are hard. And when we can do that in community, then we feel that sense of belonging, of connection, of, again, being seen and being valued and being part of something bigger than ourselves. So I've taught permaculture, you know, to groups of wild West Coast hippies who are happy to run around and hug trees. And I've taught it in Palestine to groups that included deeply religious Muslims. Again, I used many of the same tools of taking time to ground, to connect to the earth, to come into our senses, to observe. And for me, I did some training with the Wilderness Awareness School people, with John Young, back in the 90s. That was very illuminating, because I had always thought about spirituality around myth and around story and around kind of focusing on my internal imagery. They really encouraged me to rethink that, and to realize it takes some of the same tools of meditation to put yourself into a frame of mind where you can actually experience what's going on around you, where you can actually observe rather than getting distracted by all those things you should be doing, or all those emails you haven't sent, or that person you're pissed off at, and let that all go. That is meditation. That is mental training. That is magic. Be able to open up and actually be fully present in the woods, or, you know, in the meadow, or in the parking lot, observing what's growing out of the cracks. To me, that is now the core of my spiritual practice.
So it sounds like your cultivation of your ability to be present with whatever is, wherever you are, is a key tool in keeping yourself in a place where you can really show up for whatever is happening with a group, whether that's something that's comfortable or uncomfortable, and also fostering a regenerative process or dynamic or experience.
Yes, that's the same kind of awareness you might spend in the forest is the same kind of awareness I try to cultivate if I'm facilitating a group. You know, it's the actual ability to suspend a little bit of your judgment and try to see what's going on multiple levels, and then respond to it.
There's been some conversation in PAN around the theme of the edge is where the action is. So kind of for better or for worse, I think that's what you're referring to here a little bit.
Well, we always say the edge is the most creative and most diverse part of a system, which is true, or at least it's, you know, it's sort of where two systems meet, it creates this third system that is, you know, that often has more different niches and more different possibilities and more diversity, but it's also the edge where change comes, where, you know, you can think of it as having more dynamism, where the impact comes. You know, the edge of the forest, the trees grow differently than they do in the center because they're responding to the wind, and they actually grow with a little torque, a twist that helps them maintain their height and their ability to stand up when the wind is blowing. And if you cut that edge, you'll get more blowdown from the trees in the center of the forest that didn't grow with that tension. It's where creativity can happen. It's also where conflict can happen. The edge, you know, we say learning happens when you're pushing yourself, you know, out of your comfort zone. You know, if you play the piano and you always play the same piece over and over and over again, you're really comfortable, you get good at it, but you don't really improve. If you try playing something that's way beyond your capacity, you just won't be able to do it. You'll get discouraged and give up. But where you learn is where you try something that's just at the edge, beyond your comfort zone, where you have to push yourself to do it, but it's still within your capacities. And to me, that is an important quality to recognize, again, when we're teaching, when we're creating groups when we're dealing even with conflict is how do we encourage people to step a little beyond their edge in activism as well? How do we encourage people to maybe take the next step of risk or the next step of commitment without like slamming them into something that's way beyond their ability to do it?
Hmm. That's a really beautiful thought. And we have a comment from someone who's listening in that says personal enlightenment is necessary to growth, and that spirituality is just one way of conceptualizing the ethics of personal and interpersonal growth. That light moving through a prism becomes many colors, and each one is a different form of the same thing. Same with mythological perspective expressed as modern religions, philosophies, and beliefs.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, another way I might say that is that religion, you know, we could think of it as like an ecosystem of belief, that there are many different niches and many different approaches that work for different people. And maybe we need that spectrum. You know, no one religion or one group has the whole truth. We all have different parts of that prism of light. And in activism, often, you know, people often get into these things about my tactic is the best, you know, right? If you're not out in the streets, you're not really doing that. And I always say, what if we looked at activism as an ecosystem of change and has many niches? And we need those people who are out on the street, but we also need those people who are running for office. And we also need those people who are writing letters to their officials and calling them on the phone and donating money. And we also need those people who are thinkers and writers, or those people who are creating alternatives. And maybe we're each an ecosystem of activism. Maybe we're doing some of those different things at different times in different places. And rather than saying which one is the best, you know, what is the one true tactic, we should be saying, how can these different tactics support and reinforce each other and work together as a guild to help us bring change?
That sounds really beautiful to me. We have another question here. That the question is, how do you balance the cultivation of the world we want to inhabit, for example, building permaculture system examples, and on-the-ground activism on issues that can feel so huge, urgent, all-consuming of energy and will?
Mm-hmm.
For example, social and economic inequality, racism, climate change, etc. This participant says that they often feel that they could spend all their time fighting on the front lines, but they're looking for balancing the yes and no, as you framed it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the first thing to remember is that no one of us is doing this alone, that we each do our own piece. And again, that piece might change through time. There have been times in my life where I've been very much on the front lines, and times like now where I'm more focused on building the alternatives and the institutions. But that doesn't mean that I won't turn out for a demonstration or something if it's happening. That if I build those alternatives, I build them with the awareness, the understanding of the power struggles that they're posing an alternative to. And if I have alliances with the people who are on the front lines, then maybe we can figure out ways that those alternatives themselves become part of that fight. So for example, we've done many mobilizations where we brought in permaculture systems, or where we taught permaculture mini courses as part of the run up to an action. Or where one time in Miami, when we were protesting the free trade area of the Americas, somebody had gifted us with 100 ground cherry trees that we took around into the neighborhood beforehand and gave out to people and helped people plant. And that helped build relationships so that later when the cops chased everybody into that neighborhood, which was very much a Black neighborhood, and most of the protesters honestly were white people, and the cops were being very racist about like, ha ha, you know, now you'll be, you know, now you'll get what's coming to you. Like, we had friends in the neighborhood. People took protesters in and sheltered them and protected them. And many people just said, like, we would be out there with you, but they wouldn't just chase us, they would kill us, which often, unfortunately, far too true in this culture. So I think that if we're looking for those connections, we'll find them. And if we're bringing that awareness into those moments when we're standing up and saying no, when we have in our mind that vision of how the world could work differently, again, we're going to have more energy, we're going to be more creative, we're going to be more resilient when we are there out on the streets. And if we bring those awarenesses of those power imbalances into all our alternatives, then we're going to create alternatives that are not just pretty gardens, but actually embody real alternative ways of organizing ourselves socially and politically as well.
So thinking about some themes here of what you're speaking about, because obviously this is a really huge topic that we could probably talk about for at least 72 hours, I'm guessing. Yeah. I'm thinking about how in permaculture we often say that the problem is the solution. And so if some of the problems that we're facing are isolation and degradation of all kinds of systems, the solutions that you're really grounded in here sound like they're solutions of interconnectedness for fostering regeneration.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and when we can embody them, you know, in the permaculture things that we create and in the activist work that we do, then I think we have a very, very powerful movement. And we build relationships, you know, real friendships and connections, and, you know, that last and that become the foundation. I mean, I have friends that I met when we were blockading the nuclear power plant at Diablo Canyon in 1981 that are still lifelong friends and activist buddies. And, you know, the organizations and the issues and the institutions kind of come and go, but those relationships sometimes endure. And then they give you a foundation for coming together and acting as the situation around you changes.
So honoring that we've shifted into a process where we're allowing people to raise questions in a more organic manner rather than the formal Q&A period, I just want to put out a quick invitation for anyone who wants to either enter a question in the group chat box or to raise your hand to please go ahead and do that. Sometimes it is easier to manage questions through the group chat. And I see that we have a couple more questions here. So I'm going to pass on this question from one of the participants asking, is there any advice for those of us who are teachers of permaculture or who want to teach more formally around this topic of permaculture activism and spirituality?
I see that's coming from Delvin. Hi, Delvin. Good to hear from you. I would say that I think it's helpful for permaculture teachers to get some grounding and some training in conflict resolution, to do some work on these issues yourself personally around racism and sexism and white fragility and all of that, because they come up in courses. And it's really helpful when conflict arises to have some grounding and some training in how to handle it and not just get thrown off or get panicked about it. And if you do, the more that you do your own personal work around it, then the better able you will be to be a model and to help facilitate that work for others as well. I would also say part of that is educating ourselves, learning from people with different perspectives, reading. I always recommend, there's a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, who works around racism in the Black community, in the white community, and also with the police. He's a therapist in Minneapolis. And that's one I strongly recommend to start with, because he really understands how these issues work and play themselves out. And he has a very beautiful and welcoming way of encouraging people how to deal with them.
Mm. And it comes to mind also that Leah Penniman, one of the co-founders of Soulfire Farm, has written a book titled Farming While Black. Yes. And I've appreciated that the last chapter in her book is a chapter that's written for readers who are European descendants, to help us learn and grow our skills. And that's another source that's been helpful to me. Mm-hmm. Also in PAN, we're pretty proud that we started to crack open this conversation by creating an educator's pledge. And aspects of that pledge are that we're creating a safe and welcoming space for everyone who attends our classes. So we wanted to be able to start to bring, it's a self, mostly we don't have a formal enforcement system, but it's a set of, rather than rules, it's an agreement, which is a term that I also heard the folks at Soulfire Farm use when I was there yesterday. We have another question here that I'd like to fit in. The question asks, I think what's being talked about here is that our lives need to be a continuum between how we lived in a balanced way at home without, oh, I'm a little confused, and how we act out in the world. So this continuum between how we live at home and out in the world, and just wondering if you can elaborate about that at all.
I will. I see that's from Rua. Hi, Rua. Yes, exactly. That the way that we act at home and the home situation we create can be both a model and also sort of like base of our strength and resilience for acting out in the world. And then when we act in the world, that's not separate from the home that we create. In some sense, it's trying to create a world where everybody has a home and has the freedom and the opportunity to create that. Now, Bill Mollison was very big on self-reliance and taking responsibility for ourselves and our families as permaculture's prime directive, but I would sort of change that a little bit, maybe say permaculture's ultimate prime directive has to be to create a world in which it's possible for everyone to do that, to take that responsibility. Because in this world, the opportunities are not equally distributed and the resources are not fairly distributed. And part of our job as permaculturalists is to work on changing that, both because it's right and it's the just thing to do, and also because we understand how systems work and we know that systems can't maintain themselves if all the resources are concentrated in a few individuals and not shared out through the whole system. We have a world where it was something like 26 people own half the world's wealth. I mean, that's insane. That's a system that cannot survive any more than a forest could survive if 2 or 3 trees got all the nutrients and everybody else was starving. So it is ultimately in our larger self-interest to create a world of justice and fairness and equality. And we do that by embodying it as much as possible. I also want to just say a word too about energy and kindness. You know, spirituality, magic teaches us that everything is energy. Everything's a flow of energy. And permaculture sees the world that way too, as energy exchanges. And one of the ways we can look at political systems, sometimes, you know, like to turn off the sound on the debates and just observe and feel the energy that each candidate is putting out, or the energy of a discussion, or the energy of what's happening in a group. And, you know, sometimes you'll have a group where somebody is like trying to make it safe. The energy they're projecting is authoritarian. I was in a group the other day and they began a discussion of accountability, saying like, yes, this should be like a 3 strikes you're out. And you kind of go, whoa, wait a minute. That is not the energy of safety. That is the energy of control, of power over. That is not actually going to create safety. That's going to create fear and punishment. So how do we step back from that and say, well, what kind of energy do we need to create that where people can actually feel safe and feel safe to make mistakes, which we do, and have a path back to apologize, to learn, to grow. I think that's where kindness comes in, and compassion, which is something I think every spiritual tradition on the planet teaches, is that we need to treat each other with kindness. Even when we're angry, even when somebody makes a bad mistake or does something wrong, we can still respond, not necessarily with indulgence, right? That's not the same as kindness. You know, if you have somebody who's really, really doing wrong, sometimes the kindest thing you can possibly do is stop them. You know, if you have a politician in power who's harming people, then the kindest thing we could possibly do is take that power away from them. But that doesn't have to be done by dehumanizing them. You know, it can be done out of, again, a spirit of compassion for all of life and for the victims, and also an understanding that the perpetrators are doing things because of a brokenness in them. And again, that doesn't mean we excuse it, but it does mean that we don't have to generate the energy of hatred and self-righteousness about it.
Well, if there is a good place to take a pause in this conversation, and I hope that it's a pause and not an ending, it sounds like the energy of kindness is a great place for us to take this pause. So before
Can I just say a couple of things about our programs? It's earthactivisttraining.org. We do permaculture design courses, the PDC certificate courses. We have one coming up in January in California, if you want to get out of the cold Northeast for a couple of weeks. We also have a family-friendly one coming up next summer that will be in British Columbia. And we have a new program in regenerative land management. It's a longer-term training program. It's roughly 2 years after a PDC. And you can get a permaculture diploma by doing that program. And the idea is to go through a curriculum with a mentor that in the end will give you the skills and tools you need to go on and manage a piece of land and bring it back to regeneration. And we have a number of intensives that you would do. One is a core intensive to really learn the full spectrum of regenerative practices. And then we are developing a series of actual regeneration intensives where we work in a community, get together, learn something about their particular ecology, history, culture, have a project that we do that we're going to lead, that we invite the larger community to take part in, and then our students get the experience in helping to design and organize and manage and lead the teams. And we actually do some restorative work together. So if you're interested, check out our website, earthactivisttraining.org. We're actually right in the middle of upgrading it, so it may be a little wonky for the next few weeks, but you can sign up there and get on our mailing list, or you can go to my website, starhawk.org, and sign up on my mailing list, and you'll get information about all the things that we're doing.
I'm glad that you took a moment to mention those things. So in addition to our sponsor, Chelsea Green, we'd really like to, on behalf of PAN, I'd really like to thank you for giving this gift of your time to the folks in the Northeast Permaculture Network and beyond. And just want to invite everybody to continue the conversation at home. Encourage you to check out the resources. I know there are many, many resources on Starhawk's website. So thank you, Starhawk.
And Patty's going to do an online course for us next winter on permaculture business practices.
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you for mentioning that. So with that, Erin, if you would end the recording. And I'll just remind folks that we're a little bit after the hour. I'm going to stay on for another